Hi, everybody. I am Jen Paffenroth, host of today's webinar and the Business Support Manager at IEC Thermo. Thank you so much for joining us for our 5th Wednesday webinar, Feed is Key. We have two very knowledgeable industry experts joining us for today's discussion, all about the importance of feed. But first, a few very quick announcements. First off, we've been getting so many quality questions each webinar and have not, had time to answer every one of them due to time. So we are planning a live question and answer type webinar where a panel will answer your questions, totally time dedicated just to answer questions. So if you have a question related to the drying process or IEC dryer specifically or anything along those lines, you can message us on social media or email it to me at jenp@iecompanies.com, and we'd love to answer them in the upcoming webinar. Second of all, we are recording today's episode, and it will be available on our YouTube channel, IEC Thermo, as are all of our other episodes, if you're just now joining us and would like to catch up on some of the other episodes. Be sure to subscribe, follow us on social media so you can stay up to date on upcoming webinars, other IEC news, and industry happenings as well. And then at any point throughout today's webinar, feel free to write your questions related to today's topic in the Q&A section, and we will get to answering as many of them as possible at the end of the webinar. So let's get started. We'll start with some introductions. So we have Walter Hawkins and Robert Hubner. So guys, can you tell me, what does your company do? What is your role, and what services do you offer your customers?
Oh, thank you, Jen. Yes, hi, I'm Walter Hawkins, Senior Process Engineer for IEC Thermal. We do a lot of specialty dryer consulting and some obscure drying projects, but 90% of what we do is on the fastly emerging hemp and CBD industries. That occupies much of our time, but we also do work on other specialty projects with customers and with some manufacturers as well. My role in the company is mostly technical support and design and commissioning and things of that nature. And we really do try to work closely with our customers to not only supply equipment, but supply training and know-how, and try to give our customers every tool that we can give them to succeed.
Oh, let me unmute you, Robert. Hold on one second.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Robert Hubner. I'm the application specialist here at Colorado Mill Equipment. Our company is a company that builds milling machinery, specifically any equipment that would grind and reduce size, classify, separate out material by its size, and then pelleting, which is basically a densification services. Where you can take one product and increase the bulk density, make it heavier, or take a small particle and turn it into a larger particle. So we do that for a number of industries, including the hemp industry, agricultural industry, and a lot of industries where milling equipment is needed to take a product again from one state to another.
Awesome, thank you guys. So glad you can both join us today. So let's get into covering the basics here. So can you guys tell us a little bit, what is feed in regards to the hemp industry? Why is it important? And what is the relation between drying and material handling? Okay,
well, thank you, Jen. Well, I guess I'm lucky that I get to discuss the topic of feed and feed quality and preparation. It sounds terribly boring, and it would sound like it wouldn't matter, but honestly, it's probably the most difficult and most important aspect to trying to run a hemp operation. Hemp is a uniquely nasty plant to process. And what I mean by that, I mean process on a consistent basis. Make the stuff that you made on Tuesday be exactly the same as the stuff that you made on Thursday. Very tough to do. So feed, in regards to my way of thinking, is the feed that comes into the processing plant. What is what comes in from the field after being harvested and loaded out. That can be by, cutter bars, it can be by chainsaws, it can be whole plant, it can be stripped plant, it can be from combines. We see a little bit of all of it. And honestly, in my 30 years of industrial drying, the conditioning of the feed in the hemp industry is the biggest challenge I've seen, because it's very common for our customers to be running great for 2 weeks, and then all of a sudden they get into a different part of the field. Maybe the hemp is wetter, maybe the blades on the harvesting equipment are duller, whatever. But when that stuff comes in and it's changed in its fundamental properties, it affects everything significantly. So honestly, I tell people their drying and their processing is going to be as good as their feed preparation. And just another point of interest, people that grow for CBD, they are, they're very cautious to try to lose the minimum amount of salable, chemical in the plant. Probably more CBD is lost in the harvesting stage than other stages of the process. It has to be well thought out. This is not soybeans, it's not corn. It's very different. And you'll see as we get into it, we'll show you some pictures of how different feed can look. It's all the same plant, but we've had operations where they grow 5 genetics and different strains, different types, different planting densities. It all tends to affect what we see at the dryer, for good or bad. And
Walter,
as far as
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Robert.
Well, I love what you're saying about the importance of the feed there, because does it affect drying? It's a huge effect on drying. The old adage is garbage in, garbage out. And if you want to have a consistent outcome product, you've got to have consistency on your income product. And it's not just about the drawing aspect of it. You have to be very intentional when it comes to how you feed any type of a system, because the people that are really intentional in the hemp world about how they harvest and how they prepare their product, they're going to get much better results when it comes to extraction. And it's not right to go tell an extractor, well, hey, you're only getting so much out. But if you're not prepping and you're not feeding the material properly on the front sides, and you're not being intentional how you're preparing the product to come into the drying system, the other systems, then it's going to cost you so much in the long term. And so feed is so, I would actually say feed is king. That's if you're not intentional of how you're feeding your systems, then it's going to cost you so much on the backside. And it's really unfortunate, because it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, and in fact, I've seen that in other industries and other applications. Plants really only succeed in how well they can be consistent in their feed. A plant or a piece of equipment is designed for a set of conditions. Your last question, the relationship between drying and material handling. Not to get too technical, but any industrial type dryer on any scale is really a convective heat transfer device. It relies on getting air and solids in intimate contact for the heat and mass transfer that has to take place. And doesn't matter if it's a rotary dryer, our flash fluid bed design, a belt dryer, how well that air contacts the material affects how good the drying process is. And you'll get the idea when you see some of these pictures, but that's what industrial drying is intimate mixing of air and solids.
Now, when you're running a pellet mill, Walter, what happens is if I'm getting inconsistencies in the feed, I basically I may have to cut my production in half to make up for those inconsistencies. Is your dryer affected likewise?
Uh, we've got some built-in controls that can deal with variations, but definitely we've seen off-spec feed. It's still dryable in our systems, but at a fraction of the design capacity.
Mm.
And then there's all kinds of maintenance considerations as well.
Mm.
Great, thank you guys. So Robert, I really like what you said, garbage in, get garbage out. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the challenges looking back in 2019. What were some of the challenges and issues did you see people face last year regarding feed, and what were some key takeaways you learned from last year?
Well, simply put, Jen, we did about 20 jobs last year, and where we really shined, we knew we were going to shine because we had on-spec material. And where we struggled and where our customers struggled was when we had feed that that accumulated in certain parts of the system because it was off spec. We found feed to be key in 2019, and we knew it was gonna be, but honestly, I do believe we learned something from last year. We, in the off season between 18 and 19, we were contacting all kinds of harvesting companies and milling companies and all kinds of people in that world, and we tried to find the perfect chopper to give us the feed that our dryer system needs. We kind of came to the conclusion it doesn't exist in any one piece of equipment, and what we're finding is to really prepare feed for drying, it's best done in a two-phase chop. And I suppose from my past world, that shouldn't shock me. I did a lot of work in mining and minerals in the past. And when people make, copper concentrate or iron ore taconite pellets or whatever, those plants don't have one grinding device. They might have 6 grinding devices, a primary crusher, a secondary crusher,
yeah,
ball mills, sag mills, impact mills. It's a bridge too far to try to go from a tall 8-foot plant to everything being on spec for the drying process. So as a result of that, we've amended our systems this year, and we'll probably retrofit a lot from last year to have that second stage chopper. And we implemented it on 3 sites this year and saw very dramatic positive results. And I'm not going to be naive enough to say it'll fix everything, but it should really give us a much better ability to create the feed we need. It's still going to have to be harvested and delivered to the processing facility within a set of boundaries, but I think the boundaries are going to be more forgiving.
I think 2019 we really had a lot of really great steps forward. We went from people trying to just put whole plants almost into machinery on our side to really realizing that, like you said, that the right way to do it is a 2-step process. And, we had a lot of people try to convince us that they had forage wagons and choppers that could do it all in one step just by putting bigger motors and everything else on it. But, a chopper and a hammer mill are completely different types of machinery. One is a coarse grinder, one is for more fine grinding. And the bottom line is, choppers chop. That's what they do. That's what they do best. Let them do what they do best. Hammer mills and other equipment, we've got to let them do what they do best. And just as a hammer mill should not be trying to take in whole plants, we shouldn't be using forage wagons to try to make this microchip to go into any system. It just doesn't work. When we let every component basically do what it does best, the entire system runs so much better and so much more efficient. And so there were a lot of challenges in 2019, just from, sometimes you'll have a customer says, well, I really think I can do this and do it in one step. You're like, well, okay. But, I think we finally learned, and as of this year, say, if this is really what required. If you're going to go outside of industry standards, you're going to have these issues. You're going to have these problems, and we just don't want history to repeat itself. And so it's, I feel like we've really come a long ways in what we've learned as far as not just what not to do, but especially the industry is getting much stronger in establishing those best practices. And when we follow those, we get those best results.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert and Walter. All right, so moving on, I know you touched on it a little bit already, but let's talk a little bit more about out of spec feed. So what is in spec versus out of spec feed? What are some of the problems you see that come from out of spec feed? And most importantly, how can you turn out of spec feed into in spec feed?
Okay, well, very good. And I won't say this is unique to hemp only, but it's very prevalent in hemp. Hemp is an extremely fibrous plant that, you know, it's just a fine line between milling and reduction and proper sizing to going to the dark side. And I'll describe what off spec is. But on spec feed, in our way of thinking, is discrete free flowing solids with a top size of about 1/4 inch. In other words, if I grab a handful of it and I throw it up in the air, it's going to come down as a bunch of little pieces. If that same handful, I throw it up in the air and it's all stuck together and congealed, that is not discrete free flowing solids. I want to be able to aerate all those solids for the dryer to work the best. Again, we have some mechanisms to try to overcome the perfect world, but the more discrete free flowing, the better. Now, where those problems come is we really see 3 different things in the industry without a spec feed. We see just plain stuff too big to dry, and too big to dry, I know you've got some pictures on this, but 6-inch to 18-inch long, 1/2-inch diameter stems, they don't flow well through the system. In fact, they wouldn't flow well through any of the dryer designs that I know of, but the bigger piece doesn't have the surface area to dry. That's 1 degree of out of spec feed. The next degree of out of spec feed, I'm going to call seaweed or fiber. A lot of times when the harvester or the cutting head goes out in the field, things get reorientated wrong and they just strip and decortiate, and then you're left with literally seaweed. And I think I've got some pictures in here, but we've seen some fiber nests 2 foot in diameter, and they're problematic in any dryer system. They can accumulate in internals in a rotary dryer, corners in a belt dryer, and accumulate in our fluid bed, and they're a maintenance and a safety hazard. They really are. And what's worse on those nests is they'll invariably carry a lot of good on spec material in them, but it's stuck up in the nest. It's almost like forming a carpet, and that particle doesn't get exposed to gas. As to how we can turn out of spec feed into in spec feed, and I'll say again, with the caveat of being within a reasonable parameters, we find that secondary grind does a pretty nice job of breaking up the fibers, freeing up the mass, and certainly just clipping the bigs, as I call them, the bigs, the 6-inch stalks.
Yeah, when you've got an out of spec product, and to me, anything that anytime you've got product coming in, and I've seen people try to put pieces that were 6, 8-inch, 12-inch pieces into systems, and then combine that with their small particulate. It really wreaks havoc on the rest of the processing equipment. The more we can standardize everything coming in, the better everything will flow. And as with anything that is process related, the standardization is just such a key. On our systems, when people try to put in you know, a wide variety of different products into our system, basically what happens is your productivity just really falls through the floor. And so again, what we've really learned is let's really be intentional. And, you know, as a manufacturer of milling equipment, I don't want to make forage wagons. That's not what we do. Let the people that make choppers build those choppers, and let's work with the best technology in the industry for that, so that I can get the right particle size coming into my system, because that's what's going to feed everything properly into Walter's system. And it's really not difficult to create in-spec material. All it is just make sure we have that 360 view of the process and be really intentional, because the more we optimize and standardize the product coming into the dryer, the more it's going to allow IEC and the drying system to run at its optimal output. And again, that's just our end goal.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Next, we're going to put up a diagram. Walter, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about where some of the issues can come up here if feed is out of spec.
Yeah, good point. And I'll just go over some examples of some of the stuff I've seen in past jobs, going back 5 years in this industry. I've seen conditions where people would feed in some 2-foot long stems, you know, maybe ½ inch diameter. Well, if you look at the cyclone, that's a product collector from the airstream. That's where the solids drop out. It comes down an ice cream cone to the bottom of the cone where there's an airlock. Now, if I've got some 2-foot sticks, they're going to wedge themselves just right and start to pack in there, and then they're going to just fill up that cyclone with material. I've seen that before. And you clean one of those cyclones out once in your life, and then you'll say you never want to do it again, and you try to figure it out. And then likewise, if you go to the fluid bed, which is the next thing, that's where we do our finalized drying. That's really designed so when you look in there, it's a snowstorm. There's just material going up and down, real excellent solids to gas contact. Well, if you get big things or things stuck together by these fiber mats, they stay in there and they don't lift. They stay in there. In the perfect world, everything's a discrete, small enough particle. I don't ever really want any more than 50, 100 pounds in that fluid bed. I want it drying, getting light enough, and coming out to the fluid bed cyclone. And as an example, whenever we do get that big stuff, if I get a moisture on the stuff in the fluid bed, it'll always be more moist than the stuff coming out of the cyclone, because it's bigger, it's harder to transfer heat to. And that's basically it. In a perfect world, on-spec material runs through the system very quickly. Off-spec material sticks around, overheats, loses CBD, becomes a maintenance issue, has to be cleaned out. And again, I've seen on-spec and I've seen off-spec. And on-spec, there's very little maintenance and very little attention.
You know, Walter, I love your diagram here because, having seen the evolution of your company and of your systems and seen some of your early systems, it's just neat to see how, things have evolved and how you've implemented best practices. And people that don't know that you have a huge background in rotary drum dryers and built some of the largest rotary drum dryers and other types of drying systems out there. But the systems that you're using for doing hemp, you're using them because they're just the most effective. They're the best way to, they're the best and the safest way to do it. And quite frankly, some of the systems that I see out there, they quite frankly scare the tar out of me because I think, oh my gosh, it could be really bad if something were to go wrong in a drying system. You've got so much heat coming into it, and the levels of heat other people are sometimes using and trying to use triple pass drum dryers or other types of technologies where, so anyway, it's just really neat just seeing how your system has really been optimized. And I just love the fact that it's a fantastic solution for the hemp industry, and that you don't have to use the high temperatures that a lot of the other companies were having to use.
Well, thank you, Robert. And really, what I was trying to say is, well-prepared feed matters to any dryer system. It's not
Yes.
just us. I'd like to think that ours is a little more forgiving than the other ones. At least I've tried to design it as such. But yeah, the industry had plenty of nightmare stories this year.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
and it requires that industry experience. If you haven't worked with hemp, you might think that the standard other types of dryers are going to work fine, but they could be a huge fire hazard waiting to happen. And so I just really caution people about using unproven drying systems that have not been proven in the hemp industry, because there's a reason why you guys do everything that you guys do.
Well, thank you, Robert.
yeah, thanks, Robert and Walter. I think this would be a good time to go on to the next slide where we can talk about, the rotary dryer a little bit, Walter.
Okay, this is just a picture of a typical triple pass or a single pass rotary dryer. But remember what we were talking about in some of the off-spec feeds, and we'll see some pictures of it coming up. But if you had a bunch of seaweed, it's going to hang up on those metallic projections, and I've done enough forensic work where if somebody had a fire or something like that, it's always because something stays in a section of the dryer that it shouldn't be. So again, that's you can visualize what off-spec feed would be for a rotary there.
Yes, this picture is so key. Our company has a used equipment division, and you probably didn't know this, Walter, but the #1 requested item that we get for for drying hemp is one of our used rotary drum dryers. And every time it happens, I go like, oh my gosh, no, this is going to be really bad. And this is a single pass. If it's a triple pass, it would be a train wreck ×2. It's just not going to work. And so again, it's so important that the right type of dryer is used for the hemp drying application. And there's a reason why you guys have so many successful operations out there. And it's really about being intentional. And it's the feed is the feed is not just important for you, but it's important for every drying system. But your drying system is more forgiving, because anything slightly out of spec in this, boy, the whole thing could just turn into one big clump on the inside of here. And cleaning out a cyclone's bad, but I could imagine crawling into a 30-foot drum. That would be awful.
Well, I've climbed into a few of them.
Perfect. Well, let's move on to some of the pictures of out of spec feed, and we can talk a little further about those.
Okay, this photo really depicts something that we see just about at every site, and we usually see it early, and then the customer learns how poorly the dryer will run with that material. If you look at it closely, there's plenty of small stuff in there, but those bigger pieces, which are obviously 12 inches long, they're going to accumulate in that fluid bed. They cannot aerate. They don't have the lift velocity to get out, and they come out wetter, and they require manual attention to get them out. Just nothing in that picture has the feel of discrete free flowing solids, a 1/4 inch in top size.
Yep. When I look at this, it obviously says, this is going to be a challenge, but Walter, I think one of the challenges that the industry has in general is often the people that are processing and or extracting, they're bringing it in from farms, and those farms may not have the same QC that they have in their plant. And so the question that I always have to ask is, these processors, I can't think of a single negative to them having secondary grinding in their plant. If they have the secondary grinding in their plant, they'll be able to process material and then be able to get it into a system like yours. If they don't have some type of a secondary hammer mill grind, then they're really at the mercy of whatever is being brought in from those farms. And is there a negative, Walter, to doing a grind if it doesn't need it 100%?
No, I don't think so. The only downside would be, and I got to be cautious, is if you weren't watching what you were doing and you had stuff like this and it was really wet and you had small screens and you plugged up the mill, then you would start to pulp it to jello or, puree, and that's just as bad. You're fine enough, but you've now made, a spitball instead of discrete free flowing solids. But as long as you can say, I'm gonna make sure I pay attention to the mill and change the screens when I have to change, there's never a downside to going finer until you start to make mush.
In what we've used is we've always used very coarse screens in our grinding systems with very intentional flows so that the product was able to really drop in and drop out. And with that, we really haven't had any of those flow issues coming into our systems. But as long as you've got the right size screens and you've got the right flow in your system, then you should be able to grind anything that comes in, whether it's in spec or out of spec. Just putting that in line, doesn't that fix all of those other issues?
Again, I'm going to say within limits. I don't think you could use that hammer mill on a whole plant or something. It's
correct.
But yeah, I mean, if that picture depicted stuff that was maybe a 1-inch top size, then it's a piece of cake. Sure.
And one of the things that should be brought up too, and it's really important, is a lot of times people don't understand that there's 12-foot hemp varieties out there, and those really large hemp varieties, I mean, they could have massive stems, massive whatever. And so it's so important that the processes are prepared for all the different sizes of hemp. And again, by running through that chopper box first and then running it through that secondary grinder, you're going to create an ultra consistent product that's going to help you. But just because you think, oh, I saw some hemp, there's a lot of different varieties out there. And even in the same counties and towns, people are planting different varieties and having completely different results.
Yeah, and I think next week we actually have our webinar is on a harvesting webinar. So I mean, it gets a lot easier if it's a better prepared for the field. But yeah, I think the combination of a well harvested with the secondary grind is gonna be a wonderful thing.
Yes.
Awesome.
Wherever we've done it, it's the second phase grind is worked miracles.
But properly processed, this picture too, that would be a beautiful material if it was just properly processed, wouldn't it?
Yeah. You mean if that was ground up? Absolutely.
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome. We have a few more pictures here, guys. Any comments about these?
Yeah, these are some interesting photographs here. This describes picture 1. That's the fiber that I'm talking about. There's obviously some big stems and sticks in there, which the secondary mill should take care of. But there's also enough loose fiber that's entangling that stuff. So you can see as that, that mass would flow down a duct in the flash dryer or even stay in the fluid bed, it's not going to aerate, as well as it would if they were discrete. The picture 2, the one at the lower one, this is a real true case study. We had a project, very nice customer. These guys are going to succeed wildly. But when they bought one of our systems, they were basically running the hemp off to the left in the picture. And we were at about half capacity. And in this case, we just said, we can't run that material. It's, we can run it, but it's adversely affecting the capacity, and you got to shut down every 2 hours to clean things out. So the 2 pictures on 2, the 2 piles are exactly the same material, but the one to the right went through a secondary chop. The one to the left did not. That was from the field. And the minute we implemented that change, the capacity doubled in 10 minutes, and we went from, you know, having to shut down every couple hours to clean things up to not having to shut down at all. We could run around the clock, night and day.
So Walter, you're basically saying then, just by having that that secondary grinder in place at a plant, it could make as much of a 50% difference in the production or more of that plant.
Absolutely. You know, convective drying is a surface area proposition, and you know, you just can imagine how much more surface area is on the pile to the right than there is on the pile to the left.
Yep.
Definitely. Well, let's talk a little bit more then about how to get that pile on the right. So let's talk about conditioning feed a little bit more. Why is conditioning and prepping feed important, and what are the best ways to do so?
Again, we're probably just going to keep saying the same stuff, but the dryer will only behave as well as the solids are able to see air, and it's been our finding. We're 3-0 when we've done it. We've taken off spec stuff, hit it with the second mill, and as a result, we've made it standard on our systems. You can't buy our system this year that doesn't have that secondary mill. Again, I'm cautious or hesitant to say it'll work on anything, but assuming you got a reasonably cultivated field chopped material, that second mill seems to just do wonders.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything I can really add to that, Walter. Just, you know, if you know, I feel like it's such a small investment to make, and so I understand your stance of just making it a requirement on your systems, but you know, it's almost like having a filter on your gas tank. You know, you don't want to have any garbage getting into your gasoline because it'll really screw things up. And in a way, that's exactly how your system is. But it's not just like a filter. It actually is an optimizer where it improves the capacity of your plant, and it cuts off the downtime and everything else.
Yep.
Definitely. So let's share this picture of some.
Well, the only other thing, back up just one
Sure.
slide. So again, off spec material to me is stuff that's too big, or it's all nested in a bunch of fiber, which you saw in the previous pictures. Then the last one would be if you overgrind and plug up a mill and pulp. That's a problem too, because that's a sticky mass, and it, you know, goes in as a golf ball instead of a bunch of little tiny pieces of sand. So there are industries. I mean, I've certainly done a dozen dryers where you cannot feed the dryer into the material into a dryer. Good example of that is for any of us in the Midwest, the home fertilizer called Milorganite. That's actually sewage sludge from the city of Milwaukee.
Wow.
You don't dry sewage sludge. It's I don't know of anybody that dries sewage sludge as is. It'll just make, you know, giant bowls of jello. It adheres to itself. It's too wet. So the way that you can prep overly wet stuff is you can mix some dried with some wet. That's called feed conditioning. We haven't done it on hemp yet, but you know, there may be a day that somebody's got 87% moisture and it has to be done.
Great, thank you, Walter. Let's put this picture of some in-spec feed. Anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, again, go back to, you know, your memory audience of those pictures of that other stuff we saw. You just intuitively know that this stuff would dry so much better in any kind of dryer, and it would pelletize better, and it would screen better. It's just, it'll convey better. That's the kind of stuff we should be getting after the secondary mill. That's the ideal feed. That is on spec feed.
It's interesting too, Walter, because after the dryer, what is the next step anyhow?
Yeah, good point. a lot of guys just bag dried product, but more and more the bigger players are going to classification, high level classification, where they can separate the fiber and the trichomes and everything else. And those are the guys that are really going to the processors with ideal material for extraction and distillation. And they're, one thing, if you're new to this industry, you will find out very quickly there's a glut of biomass, but there's a real pinch point at the processors.
Right.
So the better you can prepare the material, the better off that is. And you're right, Robert. You're already halfway there now. You just have to do a little bit more milling and classifying.
Absolutely. So if you're gonna have to grind it anyhow on the backside, because the two ways to optimize extraction, and it's just the same with you for drying, is you can either grind it and try to open up your surface area so you can extract more, just like you would if you're drying, or you grind it and pelletize it. And a lot of our customers are doing the pelletizing just because they'll get more product into the extractor. But the first step will always be grind, and then often we'll pelletize it, and then we'll re-crack it open so that they can get 4 times as much into their extractor, increase their flow rates. But again, they're going to have to grind it. If they don't grind it enough on the pre-side of the dryer, they're messing up the efficiency of the dryer, and it's going to have to get ground anyhow. So the more you do on the front side, the less you're going to have to do on the back side.
And you would agree that it's much easier to do the final grind when it's dry than when it's wet.
Yes, you can't go all the way, but even in the wood pellet industry, nobody tries to go directly from tree to sawdust. It's a multi-step process, and you'll typically, you'll bring everything in, make it into a microchip that's consistent. You'll dry it, and then after it's dry, then you do your final, and you bring that into sawdust, because it's just the most efficient way to do things. And again, that's why that's done. It's funny because history repeats itself. And if it works in one industry, it's more than likely, and it's a fiber, it's going to be the exact same thing that's necessary in this industry.
Yeah, I think we both hit the same conclusion about the same time. And I did. I looked back and I said, my goodness, in any mining operation, there's no such thing as one grinder. It just doesn't exist.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Let's look ahead here. Let's think about any new updates or plans for 2020 for either of you, and then what advice would you give to someone looking to get involved with the hemp industry, whether that's growing or drying? Walter?
Yeah, we do have some updates for the this year's model versus last year's model. The most significant is we beat to death. That is the secondary grind. We just, we can't count on every day getting on spec material, so we're adding the secondary grind. We've also done things from a housekeeping and also product protection mechanisms. We want to lock down that product and cool it right after it comes out of the dryer. So we now have a pneumatic cooler at the very end of our system to try to really put stuff into the storage containers as cold as possible, room temperature. And as far as advice, boy, there, somebody just looking to get into hemp CBD, there's a lot of moving parts. We're all watching to see what the FDA is going to say, state regulations, genetics, harvesting techniques. My biggest advice is somebody that wants to do it, they've got to steady it and they've got to act fast. There's a lot of moving parts, and this doesn't come together in 2 months. You've got to perfect all those things because they all matter. I know this is probably a boring presentation about feed preparation, but I can tell you that's, from my point of view, the biggest driver of success or failure.
Well, when it comes to Colorado Mill Equipment and our machinery, we've we've actually taken and had to relook at all of our equipment designs to prevent all that hang up and to be able to handle the sticks and the stems and everything else that may get caught up in there. And so we've probably made about 4 or 5 design changes just to our hammer mills alone, not including our pellet mills, so that, you know, just optimizing it for these hemp applications and our customers that that are ramping up in production for that. So, you know, as far as additional things that we've got coming out in 2020, most all that stuff's already been released for this year, but we are still seeing, although the biomass and the valuation of a lot of the hemp products isn't what it was, there's still a lot of movement in that direction because it still does have strong margins. What I would advise anybody moving into that industry and wanting to look at it, I would look very strongly at what are best practices. Best practices will always produce best results. The more consistent and the more intentional you are about how you feed each one of your systems, each one of your processes, and IEC's drying systems are so important to Colorado Mill Equipment because we both take the product coming into the dryer, but we also have pellet mills that will pelletize the product after the dryer. And so, you know, it's so important that consistency in feed is really intentionally looked at. And then the last thing is, if I were getting into the hemp industry, I would really look at full plant utilization. There's a lot more look at, well, if I'm going to get if I'm going to grow the hemp for CBD, well, then I might as well also grow the seed. And if I'm going to grow the seed and the hemp, then I might as well have a classification system. And there's some really cool classification systems that Colorado Mill Equipment has partnered with that allow customers to basically have offtake product for their stock, their herd, the seeds, and basically get paid money for all of those things on top of what they're already getting for their CBD oil. So again, if we look at things from a full plant utilization, I think customers are going to have much better overall margins. They're going to be much stronger. And again, a lot of neat things coming up in terms of best practices. And anything that you do to, again, be intentional about optimizing each system. You know, Walter, I think the way we put it is you know, off spec versus on spec material, it could make a 50% difference in the productivity of the plant. And we just need to make sure that our customers that are running, you know, are running with best practices.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I absolutely concur that more and more customers are looking for whole plant utilization. And again, I would say if for no other reason, most people are going to cut down more, you know, very few guys on an industrial scale are going to really be able to just get the buds. I mean, great if you can. And strippers and things like that, they're wonderful when they work, but they have their limits on moisture and everything else from what I've seen. So
Sure.
Invariably, most people are going to bring in more than the CBD bearing component of the plant. And with such a bottleneck on the processors, the better stuff you can give them, if you can, you know, give them, you know, 12, 15% CBD that's been isolated from the mass material instead of 5, your economics are going to be infinitely stronger.
Yeah. And the great thing is the early systems out there for classifying, they were all manual, they were all hand. And these new classification systems that we're selling, it's a fully automated process. You know, we don't have to have any more hand chucking. And so again, the more it gets automated and standardized, the more profitable companies are going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Lots of exciting things to come. I think that we should get to some questions. We have about 10 minutes left today. We have quite a few questions. Some of them we can use for that question and answer one, but I'm trying to filter out the ones that are most related to today's topic. Some of these will be a short answer. Some of them are a little lengthier. So let's start with this one. Is it better to shred hemp material when it is
I have to plead ignorance here. My opinion would be more dry, although I've had plenty of people tell me it chops easier wet. What I've seen is sometimes when it's chopped or harvested really wet, it can create more of that decortication than it would on a drier basis. But again, I think some people would argue with me on that. So I've got to kind of plead indifference on that one. I've certainly seen plants do it both ways.
Yeah, I think it depends on the mill and it depends on the plant. You know, if you've got a really woody stalk, higher moisture may help you. If you've got a really a less woody stalk, then it may work against you. And it really depends on the mill. From a hammer mill standpoint, the drier it is, the better it is for grinding. But from a chopper's perspective, I think you're going to be better off wetter. But again, that would be probably a little bit better to ask the forge guys.
Sure. Great. Thank you, guys. Moving on to the next one. Are you suggesting that all stems are removed before entering your dryer?
No, absolutely not. What I'm saying is the stems have to be chopped and can't be, a half-inch diameter and 6 inches long. That's what that secondary mill does a really good job of taking care of. They can be processed. If they can be removed, that would be good for everybody if they don't bear CBD, but certainly they can be fed to the dryer. They just have to be chopped up a little bit, which again should be taken care of in the secondary mill.
Yeah, I haven't noticed any difference as long as they run through a secondary mill.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. This next question we might get into a little bit more in a future one, but I'm going to ask it here anyways. Discuss cleaning and separation equipment relationship with milling and chopping in the process flow for CBD biomass harvest.
Can you say that one more time, Jen, just so we've all got that?
Sure, definitely. So discuss cleaning and separation equipment in relationship with milling and chopping in the process of CBD biomass harvest. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Great.
Do you want me to take this one, Walter?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay, so typically, again, it's real important that we're very intentional because typically your primary steps is going to be harvesting, and then there might be just a little bit of air dry if it's putting windrows, hit it on the ground, and then run everything through a forage wagon. At that point in time, then you can start doing some classification to remove the seeds and basically pull that particular product out. Now, some people are harvesting, they're not harvesting where it has any seeds, then they may do things a little bit different. After that happens, that's when you would then typically see a secondary grind, run it through the dryer, and then at that point in time have a classification system used. And some of the more recent classification systems are just awesome because they will, after it's been dried and ground, you can then classify off the CBD material, the stalks, and the hurd material and put them in completely separate waste streams. And so it's a lot less toll on the processor, and it creates some really clean waste streams for profit margins for the people getting that product.
And I like how you said waste streams, because that's another thing that I'd like to point out. There's all kinds of products that can be made out of the waste streams. They're not waste streams at all. They have nowhere near the value of the CBD bearing material, but they're not by any means waste if they can be isolated.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. This might be another one good for you to start on, Robert. What specs are being used for biomass harvest material along the harvest, chop, mill, dry, separate process?
I'm going to say it again one more time, John.
Yep, for sure. What specs are being used for biomass harvest material along the harvest, chop, mill, dry, separate process?
So it's a difficult question to answer because different people are going after different varieties of hemp. Some of them are processing, looking for the seed, and then they're also looking to separate out all of the other materials. And so it really depends on your individual business plan, and not just your individual business plan, but it's also what type of extractor you're using. So the type of secondary grinding that may be required after the drying system is very different depending on the type of extractor. So, you know, if they're using ethanol extraction, you're not going to get near as much penetration. If they're using CO2 extraction, I'm sorry, if you're using CO2 extraction, you may not get near as much as you would with ethanol. And so you need a much finer grind. A lot of people also like to pelletize and then regrind because they get a lot more into their extractor. But it's important that my best suggestion, I would say, is you got to have a consultant. And if you need some references for consulting, both Walter and I can do that, but have a consultant that has experience with everything that you're doing to basically look at it, because for one project, it may be considered completely in spec, and the another project may be completely out of spec. We've really got to look at everything from the full circle. And I'll just throw one more thing out there on the harvesting side. I think you touched on it, Walter, is a lot of people lose a lot of money on the harvest side of things. It just goes straight up because they don't have any dust collection to contain the trichomes on the forage wagons and the chopper boxes. And that's such a travesty almost to just see all that money just go right up into the sky. So it's not an easy question to answer as a quick one-off, but I really believe the solution is to have a consultant or an engineer that can look at your product and see everything that you're doing and basically tell you how to run that process.
Yeah, and Jen, I interpreted that question a little bit differently. I think Robert's answer is perfect, but if it was the sizes of material at different stages, I would say harvested coming into the processing plant to the dryer, I'd like to see, 1 inch top size, 2 inch, 3 inch at most. Then the secondary mill will get me to that 1/4 inch that we desire. And then after that, depending on what the back end classification is, those systems will have different degrees of grind, but you get progressively smaller as you go down the page.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. Might have time for 1 or 2 more. Okay, so let's do this one. What kinds of grinding equipment work best for high moisture content biomass?
What types of grinding works best for high moisture biomass?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. From what we've seen, again, the key is that 2-stage grind. Get the coarse cut at 2 inch, 3 inch max. Go into the mill that's at the front end of a dryer system. If we're really wet, we may have to eliminate the screen entirely, but ideally not. We can find a right screen for a material, because we have to make sure that we don't pulp. That's for sure, and we can't plug up the screens. But I'm going to say with the combination of controls on the secondary mill speed, screen selection, it gets a little harder when it's wetter, but maybe we can't get as small as we'd like on a really wet material, but we can still aerate and break up fiber and improve the material with that second stage.
One of the things that I think is really important is what we consider wet material in some places of the United States. So say your process, you're in Florida, you say, oh, this is kind of a wet product. That may be completely different to what somebody in Colorado that's irrigating that cut off all the water. Wet material to them is completely different. And so again, it's kind of hard to answer what's the best way to do things all the time, simply because you may have different options. you're not going to get any air drying in the field at all in Florida. You might get a little bit, in Colorado, but every stage and every facility is going to be a little bit different. And so if much as possible, try to use a chopper box or a forge wagon on the front side, and then a knife or hammer style grinder as the secondary is really key.
Yeah, and what would you say you've seen, Robert? I would say most guys we see around 70, 75 would be a typical deal. We've seen mid 80s, and that's a little more problematic. And then in the more arid climates, we see 50%. And I've heard of people being 30. I've just never seen it.
Sure.
30 would be like Christmas for us.
My big concern, Walter, is we're seeing a lot of growth in a lot of the southern states, Florida, Texas, and places where it's very, very moist, and they're just not going to have, it's going to be very, very wet. They're going to have to be much more intentional about how they chop and what they can do to dry, because it's if they try to leave anything out, it's just going to mold. It's going to be very bad. Whereas if it hits the sun for a little bit in Colorado, yeah, you can lose some moisture. But you try to do that in Florida, you might just mold. It would be very, very catastrophic.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you guys. Well, we've gone a little over 4 o'clock already, Central Time. We have several more questions we didn't get to. Really good questions today, everybody. I would really encourage you, if you have a question specifically for Robert about the mills or anything else that he does, shoot him an email. I'm going to put his email address up right now, robert@freedomequipment.com. He's more than happy to help answer any questions, as well as Walter. So I just want to say, Robert and Walter, thank you so much for sharing so much valuable information with everybody today. It's been really helpful. And then next week, we will have Corbett Hefner, the Vice President of Formation Ag, will be joining us to talk all about hemp harvesting, something that proved difficult this past year for many farmers. So be sure to sign up for that one. And thanks so much, everybody. We hope to see you guys next week.
Thanks,
well, thank
Jen.
you,
Take
Jen.
care.